is a completely unplanned bit of work. I was thinking about changing my basic design of how the imports work. So I'm going over the code I've got and the math packages and what I want to do for documentation. And I was thinking, what other calculations do I want to build in? What other abilities do I want early on? Before we get into the complexities of doing our moon orbit. So this stream is actually in save 3 of my development area, which I'm using to do some tests of some early game things. So what I've got is a script that will hover. Real simple. There's actually example code for PID controllers out there which does a real simple hover script, and those work fine. PID controllers and in general error controllers work really well when you are in a state fairly close to your target, to where you can linearize the system and where a proportional integral derivative controller can give you good behavior. But what I want to do is I want to do a hover script that can handle getting to that hover altitude from a long ways away, which means that your simple proportional controller, you're going to be trying to say, well, I want my velocity to be proportional to how far I am, and that's not correct, because the formula is a little different when you're doing actually this is the stopping time problem. So if we are going to be decelerating to stop at a certain time, we want to do a constant deceleration, then our position is proportional to the square of the time. And if we then solve the equations of motion here and get time gone, what you find out is that if I pick my acceleration and I know my distance, the speed that I want is not proportional to the distance, it's proportional to the square root of the distance. In fact, it's the square root of 2 times the acceleration times the distance. So what I did was I did a modification of a normal controller. So if you look down here, when we are close to the set point, I'm basically going to pick an acceleration and right. So my control term here is basically some constant times my error. So this is our normal proportional control of velocity based on how far our distance is out. And this combines with the rest of this code to do those fine grain adjustments. The specific terms in here relate to what we're doing. We're outside this 10-meter band. So inside the 10-meter band, it's a proportional controller here and here. If we think of this as a controller that is controlling velocity, and we're tracking our position as the integral of the error, then this is a PI controller. And I believe it could be mathematically modeled as such, but I do not have a deep understanding of controls theory. I have forgotten what I knew, and I was never a true expert. Anyway, here is what I reasoned for this controller. I said, I wish our current state was this particular altitude and this particular velocity. This is my perfect thing. And steady state, if we call hold over and over and over again with a given set and a given H set and V set, it should approach these. So our error controller will reduce the error. And the way these controllers work when you've got these linear terms is you actually have an exponential decrease, because your speed at which you're reducing the error is proportional to the size of the error, and well, that's an e to the x for some value of x. So what I do is I compute a few things here. I've got some up front. I want to know how much thrust I've got available to me. That's going to control overall how we're going to behave here. We've got a thrust max, which is going to be available thrust, and I'm not going to let it go to zero. I'm going to pretend even if we are staging, we still have a very tiny amount of thrust available, so we won't be dividing by zero. We get our maximum acceleration, which is thrust divided by mass, but that's in whatever direction the vessel is pointed, so we could be up this way, and we could be straight up, and we could be over this side. So now we want to get our up direction. We'll really get the cosine of that angle. So as we deviate from the angle, we're going to reduce the amount of thrust we have upward. What's the cosine? Well, that's just the dot product of the two vectors, okay, in the unit direction. So we're going to take the facing vector, which is what direction we're pointed, and the up direction, and we're going to take the dot product that will give us this value from 1 coming down to 0 of our net fraction of our stuff that goes up. So now we have, what is our actual net thrust we can get upwards? It's our maximum thrust times that cosine minus gravity. So the total net acceleration we can get upwards has to take into account that we're being pulled down by gravity. So our actual acceleration will go from anywhere from the acceleration of gravity downward up to our thrust upward degraded minus gravity. And now we're going to pick a nominal acceleration upwards. So when we're planning this, what I want to do is if we're above the plane, if we're above the altitude we want to be at, as I come down, I really would like to plan it so that my perfect trajectory, I'm decelerating at something less than full throttle. So I have a chance to do error correction. So if I come in a little hot, I've got that little extra bit of throttle I could toss in there. So there's our nominal. So a nom is going to be the acceleration that we're going to aim for when we're coming down. And I've got a radar package that I can calibrate. In this case, we're actually going to calibrate it so radar colon out left percent right percent is actually out colon radar, sort of. So I go over the equations of motion. V is AT and x equals AT squared over 2. So we eliminate t, we get V equals square root 2ax. So if we're above the set point, then here's the curve we want to be on when we're decelerating. We want to be on a curve where at any given height error, our velocity is square root of 2 times a times the height error for some acceleration a, which is going to be this a nom val. So this acceleration that I can attain, that's what I want to be this a term inside this square root. Okay, and if I do that, then I should reach velocity 0 when my error does. My error, altitude error, my velocity error should come to 0 at the same time. So that's a nice smooth curve. For below the set point, same thing, but I'm not going to burn my engines pointing down. I'm going to keep my vessel pointed upwards, so my acceleration is going to be downward at the speed of gravity. So again, V equals square root 2ax, so the distance is h error, so h error from where I am to my set point, and the acceleration due to gravity, and this gives me the velocity upwards, the ascent velocity, and so that if I'm at the ascent velocity, gravity will slow me down, so my velocity hits 0 as h error hits 0. So those are my two equations, and I have separated them because I may not be able to thrust to get a net acceleration upwards of 1g. That would be kind of cool, but you may have a lower TWR. So that's what this handles. So we're going to command a velocity. Okay, so based on our set point, we are going to adjust some things. So we start off with our caller said, in the best of all possible worlds, I would have a velocity of 0, or maybe they're going to call it, they're going to say we're at 100 meters at a velocity of -1, and they're going to call it a tenth of a second later saying we're at 99.9 meters at a velocity of -1, and so on. So by having an H set and a V set both, that means I can not only hover, but I can gradually change my altitude. This gives you control over both the altitude and the ascent rate. So, initially set V command to VSET. Then we're going to modify it. So, if we are a long ways above the ascent point, so here's where we want to stop, we're way up here. Okay, well that's the equation we just looked at. So we're going to compute our velocity here, which is 2, times the acceleration we want to be experiencing when we are on the track, times the error. And the error is just the observed minus the set. Okay, so this gives me a nice positive value. It makes it easier to debug when I do it this way. Later on, we may find ways to wrap all of these functions together. I don't know. It may or may not be worth it. I probably won't even look at it in the future if it just works. So distance is how far we are above it. Here is the velocity we want to subtract from our set point. So if they're saying be at 0, when we get there, I want to induce a negative velocity of this. So I want to be descending at this velocity. Descending at this velocity in addition to the set velocity. So we update the command by subtracting out our error control term. Now, if we are closer than 10 meters, instead of doing this, plan on accelerating at this constant value, which is fairly high, if we did that all the way down to 0, what you end up with is you get down to 0, it's nice and smooth, but then your engines go pop, 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 because they're always either off or all the way on, and don't like that. So under 10 meters, I turn it into a linear controller. So I set this up so that here's the same calculation here. So V sub, when I cross the 10 meter line, I'm going to freeze that. I'm going to calculate that. And the closer we are to 0, so between 10 and 0, I'm going to do a linear ramp based on my error across 10 meters. Now, coming up from below, same sort of thing. We have a distance we want to rise, and knowing that distance and gravity, we know how fast we should be moving up right now to be able to rise to that. So we are going to add that into our command. So that will get us there. And again, if we are closer than 10 meters, we are going to take the value of the computed thing at 10 meters, and we're going to linearly ramp that down. So what should happen is we get these nice square root curves coming in. So nice parabolic curves in the of velocity, and velocity is linear, and the acceleration is constant, and the position is square root of. Until you get down to here, where suddenly our velocity ramps down. So this means that for small errors, we're commanding small velocities, which is great. So that's our velocity command, which is going to be plus or minus something. And we get down here and say, well, what is our current speed? Current vertical speed. And what is our error? Okay, so we may already be going the right speed, which would be really cool. So then we figure out, well, if we're not going the right speed, we need to add some acceleration. So our acceleration command is sum gain times the error. So this is just a proportional control of velocity, where we are commanding acceleration proportional to the error of velocity. Simple P controller. Well, our actual acceleration we need to get out of the engines is this command plus gravity. Okay, so there's that. So if we wanted to slow down a little bit, we wouldn't be trying to run the engines negative. We would let gravity slow us down. It might be that we don't want to slow down as fast as gravity will slow us down. So this may run the engines at a low speed. If we are dead on, this will run the engines at the appropriate throttle to just exactly counterbalance gravity. And if we're not exact, we're going to go up or down a little bit, and it will correct the position. So it gets us, this is actually a PI controller because we are also correcting our position. And then we say, what's our throttle command? Well, if we ran our throttle at 1, we'd be getting a net out of it. If if we ran it at 0, we'd be getting 0. So it's just the CNet here divided by ANet, and that gets us a command. So simple little script that calculates what our current thrust should be. This looks at where we're pointing, but it doesn't try to control our steering. So now let's look at hover configuration 1. All it's going to do is jump up off the launch pad by about 100 meters, and then it's going to tell hover, hey, please hover at 200 meters. And it's going to do that for 30 seconds. It's going to say, hey, please hover at 50 meters. It's going to do that for 30 seconds. And these are all done by doing, set throttle to hover hold of H. Just do that over and over again. We could lock throttle. That would work too. I was fiddling around with how long to wait here. Waiting 0 does it as fast as possible, so that's the same as a lock. I slowed it down as far as wait a tenth of a second, and it still seemed to work. So we'll mess with that. This is still in a Go script, so this is still prototyping. The hover hold looks like it's going to be pretty correct. And then last we say descend at 3 meters per second to altitude 0. Well, here's how you do a descent. We start off with some altitude h and some descent speed, which I'm putting in v, and that's 3. I'm going to descend at 3. And I'm going to calculate when I plan on hitting 0 altitude. So that's time in seconds plus our altitude divided by our velocity. Then we can say, well, we're going to descend from the current altitude at the given velocity. Then we go into our loop that says until our time hits, calculate what altitude we wish we were at right now, which is probably going to be pretty close because we've been hovering at the right altitude. And then we're going to hover hold at h, comma, minus v. So this says introduce a speed bias into it. Now there is going to be a little blip as we transition from going level to starting to go down. We cannot instantaneously accelerate. So there'll be it'll go off the end, it'll overcorrect a little bit, and then it will track down with the altitudes. So again, that's why I say it's much like a PI controller, in that the position that we're putting in, the h value that we're putting in here, is the integral term of a velocity controller that we're using. So let's take a look at what it does. So here's H1. We've got way too many engines and way too many fuel tanks and all of that. This middle fuel tank has been emptied, and we are early in the game, so we still can only have 18-ton mass. So this is, I had to tweak things to get it to fit. So if we launch this, better turn off the editor. That editor may have been blocking stuff. We'll see. So I've turned on the MechJeb flight recorder here so we can see what's going on. We're going to chart the radar altitude, which it calls true altitude. And the horizontal axis I've got set to time. Often that'll be set to downrange distance, so you can get the shape of a descent curve. And let's take a look at our debug console over here. We see that I have a radar package which has calibrated. It says at my, what I'm going to call 0 is radar altitude of 3.375. There we go. Now I actually, in my Go script, I explicitly went in and zeroed out the calibration. So when we go to 200 meters, it will go to radar altitude 200, not to 200 above the ground. So the zero calibration stuff here is all for getting actual distance between the ground and the bottom of my bell. But that's okay. So we're going to leave that radar and we're going to hit this. First step is we're just going to shoot ourselves up to 100 meters. And then we're going to have hover take us to 200 meters. And we overshoot a little bit at 200 meters, but not a whole lot. And we're going to hold here at 200 meters. This is nice and stable. And not even changing. I've got no vertical speed. I'm just sitting there at 200, just perfect. First time I used an air controller like this in real life, I was like, wait a minute, you mean this can fly this aircraft and hold an altitude to within less than a foot of air? And the researcher came back to me and said, well, yeah, to within less than a tenth of an inch, actually. So now we hit 50 meters. Boom, and we're holding it. And because I've got that linear section of the controller, our engines aren't bursting, they're just holding steady at this 30 or 40%, whatever the number is, whatever the correct number is, it calculates it. And now we're going to descend at 3 meters a second. And this is kind of a bit harder to hold on to, but it works. And there we stop. So that's one of them. The next thing is, how can we use this for something starting out at a higher altitude? What happens if we are coming in from really high? Can we use this to replace the hover slam landings? Hover slam is when you wait until the last second and then you turn your engines on full bore and you turn them off just as you touch down at zero velocity. It's called a suicide burn or a hover slam. Often you'll end up hitting the ground at 5 meters per second or something. We could do one better. What I'd like to do for moon landings is come down and hover at a given altitude and allow the user to move around laterally while holding altitude, and then on command do the remainder of the landing. So stabilize horizontal velocity and bring it down to H2. Again, this is pushing the weight limits I can use right now. But basically I cut from 4 to 2 liquid fuel engines. I put some liquid fuel back in the middle here and added some boosters. So the boosters are going to get us up nice and high, and I will be firing the center engine during ascent to get a little better control. And that will push us up to a couple thousand meters, and then we'll fall down from there. I think that's an adequate test case, and we're going to come down and let me check the numbers in the editor here. Don't need to really show the script, but we're going to tell the hover script to stop us at 25 meters. So if we overshoot on the way down, we're going to slam into the ground. We should come down to 25 meters and hold there for a bit and then drop down. I don't have any action groups yet, so I can't put anything in to say go. I don't want to hook up the GUI quite yet, so there's going to be no GUI button to say here's the spot. Eventually I'll need buttons for things like cancel horizontal velocity and land here and increment or decrement our altitude and so on. But let's take a look at this guy. So again, I'm going to toss up the flight recorder here and the debug console. And there we go, set complete. And this apoapsis got pushed up to a little over 5 kilometers, so we'll be under 5 kilometers when we turn around. We should have a nice parabolic curve here. We'll toss in the surface speed. So you notice the surface speed tends to be all straight lines, so we're accelerating at about a constant acceleration. And we're decelerating by gravity, and now we're accelerating downward by gravity. We unfortunately don't have a vertical speed plot on here. And now the engines kick in, and we're running about half throttle, which is what gives us 2 Gs. So I limited the the acceleration on the way down so that it would never do more than 1G net. And we get down to here and burst the engines a little bit, and now we are hovering nice and stable at 25 meters above the ground. And then we come down, blip, 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 and there's the landing. Nailed it. So I'm going to package this up and send it into the repository, which is now collecting a new series of packages that don't do anything with the global namespace. I think I'm going to try that. I tried it earlier and it got too weird, and then I went back to save 2 where I was putting everything in the global namespace. I think what I've found now is kind of an adequate compromise between the designs, which actually works pretty well. Anyway, so there you have the hover script, and I will come back when I've got a little more. Bye.